right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the 262nd episode of the Crash Bang Boom podcast. Today's guest is producer, engineer, and more, and Andrew Schneider. Andrew and I get into the early years of his foray into the industry, some of my favorite albums that he produced, his experiences at Steve Albini's Electrical Audio, and a whole lot more. So I hope y'all dig the convo as much as I enjoyed having it with someone that is one of my absolute favorites in the world of audio production. Also, check out the links in the description of this episode for Andrew's studio at acreaudio.com. Today's episode is sponsored by my man Carson Gant, aka OneUpLoops.com. Carson and his team spent a preposterous amount of time recording over 400,000 shaker, tambourine, and hi-hat loops at every possible tempo in multiple feels with incredible mics and outboard gear for you to pick and choose. It's organized for you to find exactly what you need with just a few clicks, and everything feels and sounds incredible. You can sign up for free and check it out and gain full access to all 400,000 loops starting at just $5.99 a month. No download limits, whatever you want, whenever you want. New loops, one-shots, and drum breaks are being added weekly, so check it out at OneUpLoops.com. Crash Bang Boom podcast can be found on iTunes, Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Luminary, Google Play, Podbean, and Amazon Music Podcasts, to name a few. Feel free to check out any of the previous 260-plus episodes and give me a like, a subscription, and/or a positive review, as the support is appreciated. All right, here we go. Andrew Schneider. I know it's only rock and roll, but I like it. Crash Bang Boom.
Crowds go mad with joy.
All right, I'm here today with one of my favorite producers, engineers, and more, and Andrew Schneider. Definitely excited to rap with you today, Andrew, and I was thinking about it. I mean, we worked together on a record maybe 8 years ago, and I've seen you throughout the years in various other spots, but yeah, it was about 8 years ago.
Is that right?
Yeah, man, and at the time, you were working a good bit with the Blue Man Group. Is that something that you're still doing? Are you still working with them?
I am not. They pretty much closed up their whole sort of creative department. There was a branch of the company was called Blue Man Productions, and It was in New York, and it worked a lot on the new creative as well as sort of sustaining the shows. And so whenever I worked with them, I worked with that part of the company, and that part of the company has since been closed down. So they have their shows are still active, and there is, a lot of work in the cities, but the creative core of sort of directors and producers was shut down shortly before the pandemic, actually.
Wow. I mean, to what capacity were you working with them? Because I know it's such a really cool production live. I mean, were you mixing surround sound stuff for their live productions? Was that what you were doing, or no?
I have a long history with them where I was hired to work on specific projects for a long time, mostly recorded studio projects. So like their first album, I engineered, and that was a long time ago. And that was like a year and a half process. That was crazy.
Whoa.
And then the second record, I was hired to mix it, but then ended up getting brought in to do a bunch of engineering on that one as well. And then, subsequent releases, like a bunch of like live things, they would bring me on to mix. And then, oh boy, probably 2014, something like that. I worked with them more closely. I worked with them on staff as a creative director and the head of the studio there. And once I was in that role, I was more involved in the audio that was going into the shows. And so, yes, there was a lot of 5.1, 7.1 mixing, then working with all sorts of different audio platforms, as well as working on a lot of the compositions for new material as well. And, basically wearing the hat of a director and a producer at the same time. So,
whoa.
Yeah, it was dense.
I was about to say, it sounds both challenging, but I mean, I'm assuming there must have been some learning curves, but ultimately a pretty incredible experience, it sounds like.
By the time we did the third album I was producing and engineering. I was co-producing with the music director and engineering that one as well. And the learning curve was actually for me to sort of connect into a more corporate atmosphere of recording and being part of something bigger,
Yeah, of course.
Because I was my whole history is working with like, somewhere between 3 to 6 people in a room, and usually most people leave us alone, and I would act as the buffer just between a label and a band. I would sort of like try and separate that, and I could control all of that energy. And you can't do that in a company of that size.
No, no, you
You
can't.
realize, quickly, like ways that you can be supportive and ways that you can bring more to the table, and then conversations that you don't need to be a part of. Just walk out the door. The gift in working with that company is just the talent of everyone involved, like both the performers as well as the writers and creators and composers.
Right.
That is some top-notch stuff. I mean, the even just the audition process with them is pretty intense, both for Blue Man and band. As Blue Man in particular, you have to sort of like be half actor, half musician, and
Yeah.
usually someone's better at one than they are at the other. So like,
right.
it takes months and months to find the right people. And with the band too, it's like, it's a specific thing, because you could have like the sickest drummer in the world, but they don't sort of understand the pocket where that drummer lives,
Right.
for that music, So anyway, at the end of it, at the end of that whole process, you end up with really unique and really talented, gifted performers and people. So that was the pleasure for me. There wasn't a day that I was in a room with someone where I'm like, just the finger goes there, dude. Like that never happened.
Wow. That's cool, man. I mean, with producers, and it's a term that's been thrown around within music, and it took me a while to sort of understand what that even encompasses, but I think with like bigger budget scenarios, especially like in the pop world where, a producer is brought in to basically help write and sculpt the song as a reassurance for maybe the company that invested in it to get the return in the form of a hit. There's like at the crazy pop level, there's that sort of producer.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, you do everything from engineering to mixing to everything in between, I think that probably all falls under the umbrella of a producer. But from what it sounds like the majority of your career has probably been kind of being the liaison between a label and the band and just capturing the band, as opposed to maybe sitting down with the expectations of you completely sculpting the writing process and everything else within a record, right? I mean, has that kind of been it?
It depends on the project. There's definitely been plenty of both in the records that I've made, but usually by the time I'm working with the band, the music is for the most part written. Yeah. And then, my main job is capturing that and presenting it, in a way that the band is going to be behind and proud of, and then myself as well.
Yeah.
This has been like kind of a hot subject for a long time. And I do think that as soon as you're making choices, in a room with the band about, how to present the song, those are production choices. So I never really feel that comfortable being listed as a sole producer, but I feel that everyone that's in that room is producing, making choices on the fly that are choices that are going to finally, identify what the presentation of that song, what that is,
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really straightforward and very easy. Sometimes it is almost more of just a straight engineering thing, but you can break it down step by step from like, what snare drum, how distorted a guitar is going to be. Why are you playing it that clean, or why are you playing it that dirty? Mm-hmm. What is this section isn't really going anywhere. You're losing the momentum of the song. So those are production conversations, but they're production conversations on like a 2-week mid-level recording budget where we're trying to do the absolute best that we can in a very small amount of time. So, so I think of myself as like an engineer producer, and but not. I'm usually not in full Rick Rubin mode, tearing apart someone's art and then telling them, no, this is what your art should be. That's usually not where I'm at.
Yeah, I don't know that I could do that. That would be a tough job to lean that heavily into that aspect of it. But
it depends on how a project is presented and brought to me. There's definitely projects where I've had the pleasure of having someone say, these are sketches. What can we do now? And then it is more like that. And that is a great experience. And that shows a lot of trust from the artist on me to be a part of those decisions. And I really love that. But usually that is something where you're talking about spending like 3 months or 6 months on a project, and
Wow.
there's not a lot of budgets for that in the world that I live in. So those projects are a little more rare for me, but I enjoy them when I'm part of them as well.
Yeah, man. I was just
Yeah.
looking back kind of at your discography throughout the years. And I mean, from working with bands like Cave In, Keelhaul, The Ocean, Zozobra, Unsane, Rosetta, Pelican, like you mentioned. I know I love the records that you both played on and worked on with Pigs. It's definitely, all of those are like collections of some of my favorite records, man.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but I know you just got back from Steve Albini's electrical audio studio. What was your experience like working out there?
I've done a few records in the B room of that studio. This is, I think, the fourth or fifth time I've gone there, and it is always like it's an incredible spot, and it's always inspiring. Not only knowing some of the other records that have been done there, but just the way the whole space is laid out, and then working with the people inside that space. Like it is professional in the fact that everything works. There is really exciting gear. The microphone selection is the best that I've ever come across. It's
Wow.
so you don't go in there without trying something new every time,
Right.
because there's so many options. You take someone like Greg Norman, he's an engineer there. He's also the technician there, really talented at both. So everything works. He understands the running of the place, but he also helped build the walls of the studio.
Right, right.
And then the B room, which is the studio that I've done all the work in, is just a fantastic mutant room. It's like the size of if you took a gymnasium and you cut it in half, and it's you bring up the mics from that room and you know that you recorded in that room.
Wow.
It's just a unique, specific space. So
That's awesome, man. I was thinking about some of the Albini records, and I mean, again, some of sort of my favorites would have to be both Liar and Goat from the Jesus Lizard, and then of course, you
yeah,
have to throw in Utero from Nirvana, or at least I would.
yeah.
But when I think about your sort of where bass sits in your mixes, generally, it's always got a great kind of grit to it, and it really sits in the mix really well. And one of the bands where I feel like I really heard that or was aware of it was kind of listening to those aforementioned Jesus Lizard records. I mean, were those at all an influence to you about where sort of maybe bass tone could go and or sit in a mix necessarily?
I mean, perhaps those were definitely important records. You can include like Rid of Me, PJ Harvey that's in my top 10 list of all time.
Nice.
If I'm Stuck on an Island records, or even those early Pixies records. Like there is a specific sound, and I would say that the sound was inspiring to me. Where the bass necessarily sat, I mean, I'm sure on some level, because I love the sound of those records. I love the energy of those records, is what
Yeah.
it was, more than necessarily like I don't think I ever sat there and was like, looked at the specific tone. It was like, oh, I got to try notching my bass at 700 hertz.
Yeah.
But the energy of those records and the space and the movement of them was something. So I'm sure in some way that affected me. I think the biggest early on bass influence for me was some earlier Swans records. Al
Interesting.
Kizzy's was that's the guy that got me playing bass, like listening
Really?
to the power. Yeah, I went to see them very early on around, I mean, for them, they'd been a band for a while, but I got to see a few times on the Children of God tour, and just the massive presence and power that both he and his instrument had. That
Right.
was really direction changing moment for me,
Wow. That's
Yeah.
really interesting, man.
Oh yeah, man, that guy's pure power.
Crazy. I mean, I think you and I are fairly close in age, man. I mean, assuming the path started with you in the late 80s with heading down the road of producing, engineering, et cetera. I mean, similar to what most people probably did. Did that mean that it started a lot with 4-track recordings and just messing around with cassettes and all of that? That was the starting point.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think when I was a kid, um, and like there was a lot of like coming out of like a lot of new wave stuff, but also the beginning of a lot of like industrial type stuff and
Uh-huh.
cutting and stuff like that. I remember I had a dual tape deck, and I would do my own like Ministry remixes.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. From the first record, from that first sort of like the more synthy record.
Before they were like so much industrial necessarily.
Yeah. But I think like the whole thing was going in that direction, and that was I was, definitely naive to the direction, but I think I was sort of becoming a part of it as I was getting a little bit older. So I started with that, and then I got my 4-track, and then there was not. I was I think I've said this before, but I was definitely the annoying guy in the band that like every practice had to be recorded and recorded right. Sometimes you just want to try and see if you could play a song, but not with me in the room. No, you had to record everything. So I had the 4-track, and then I got an 8-track reel-to-reel, an Atari MX 5050, and that became my mobile rig to try and start recording bands around town, around Boston, where I grew up. Mobile rig is hysterical in today's world because it was the older 2-piece model, which is about the size of a small fridge, and then you bring like 4 Tupperware containers worth of like snakes and mic cables, and then whatever mics you had, so it was like
right.
A van worth of my mobile stuff to go to people's practice spaces to record records. But I did that a bunch. And then I was also I started interning at a studio that my old band had recorded at, and so it just started to snowball more and more and more. It became something I really truly enjoyed, and realized that I could be a part of something artistic and creative. I could be involved in something that was doing that, but also I could make some sort of life out of. So there's a way to sort of like have a career and have intrinsic satisfaction in what I was a part of creating.
Mm-hmm.
And once I figured that out, a switch went in my brain, and then I never stopped.
Right.
That was it.
There's another bizarre circle of connections here where one of the bands that you've worked with throughout the years in Fashion Week, and I've also played shows with out of Brooklyn, the drummer at the time, I was playing in a different band, and he came up to me and he said after one of the shows, he said, "Oh man, you remind me of this drummer that I really dig from this band from Boston, Barbera." And I thought, and I was like, well, it's like, send me some of the shit so I could check it out, because I didn't really know where to find it. And it turned out that you were in that band. I don't recall him mentioning it at the time. And then, like I said, I would go on to play some shows with Fashion Week. And again, that sort of tied back to this first time that I met the drummer at the time, and Carl, who said that I reminded him of the drummer that you played in a band with, which is so bizarre.
Right, Mike Yashinsky, and that is a great compliment, Mike. I've got to work with some of the best drummers in the world, and in my mind, he is right up there. That guy has feel like it's unbelievable. You get in a room with him, and you might have to hash out concepts and ideas, but in terms of just him behind the drums, he's a painter. It's fantastic getting to work with him.
That's awesome. Where are those? Is there a Bandcamp with any of those recordings out? I know it's not on any digital platform, right?
There is not, and I've had more and more requests of people that wanted to get involved in it. There was only two. Well, there was one EP, one full length, and then a 7-inch that we did on Hydra Head as well. And It's kind of my intention to try and figure out the best way to put it out there without any need for it to sort of like to remove any sort of monetary thing from it, and just have it free for people to have. So right now, all I've been doing is when people request it, I've been sort of like sending it along. I have no physical copies of it, but I do have the recordings, because it's funny that we have a small but impassioned fan base of people that really want to hear it. So like about 5 times a year, I get someone reaching out to me like, I can't find it, I need it. So and I want to make it available. I just don't want to have it be anything other than just sort of, here it is, and I haven't figured out the right way. I think there's a free version of Bandcamp you can do, but I haven't got that far into it.
Gotcha. Yeah, Carl actually sent me the MP3s for it, and I remember hearing it, thinking that it was awesome. And then, of course, sometime later, before I was necessarily really solid with backing up some of my files, at some point I must have lost them. So yeah, I'll hit you up, and maybe you could send them to me after this, because I'd like to get them again.
Times a year, someone asks me for. Yeah, I'll get them to you.
Awesome, man. I was thinking about when I moved to New York, which was '05. I think you moved to New York around '03.
That's right.
What was your sort of impression of living and working in New York at the time in the early 2000s?
I had done, I had been working in New York mostly with Blue Man stuff, but I'd been working in New York since like 98, 99,
Wow.
coming up here and doing a bunch of work. So I was I was comfortable with the city, and I was comfortable with studios around. I'd found a couple of favorite spots when I was at my end living in Boston. I knew I wanted to make a move, and I did the LA search, I did the New York search, and New York felt like an extension of Boston to me. Like I felt a lot more comfortable here.
Yeah.
And so you pack your bags and you go and you see what happens. uh, but it felt really comfortable. The other thing that was good about staying on the East Coast and being in New York is I've felt a continued connection with a lot of underground music that was coming through,
Hmm.
and actually like that was a big part of the label Co-Extinction that I did with the other guys from Pigs, with Jimmy and Dave. Was it was supposed to be like a stopgap place for people that were like in between big releases or like on tour, had a day off, and wanted to sort of like just have a low stress chance to just do a recording.
Yeah.
Just make a recording. You don't have to worry about the pressure of like when to release it, how many and a lot of the success of that concept was being New York based, where you're getting bands traveling through. This is a pretty heavy traffic corridor, between New England and then going south. So, and honestly, I just love it here. I love the city.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely, man. In talking to JR, the drummer at Cave In, it was interesting sort of traversing the trajectory and of their career over the years. And one of the really interesting points was when they went to RCA and did the Antenna record, and then got dropped and went back to Hydra Head at the
yeah.
time. Then they hooked up with you and ended up doing the Perfect Pitch Black record, which I really love. And he said that it was kind of like them like coming home after sort of
Oh,
the experience of being with RCA, and then again going back to Hydra Head, and then working with you, and just the process was so easy and
yeah,
just
yeah.
natural. And he said that he felt like the record sort of reflected that. So
It was definitely a little bit of that vibe for me too. I met them before RCA, Barbaro and Cave In did a bunch of shows. I think we did like a long weekend tour. I can't remember exactly where I met them. I think it was around the release of Jupiter, because I can't remember. The studio I was running at the time, we were doing live recordings for WBCN, the big rock radio station there, and I was right across the street from the studio. And
cool.
that was I might have known them before that, but that was the first time we worked together, and it was really chill and easy and fun. And then when we did Tides of Tomorrow, that was the first time that I got to sort of like actually be in a room in a recording studio and start a record from the ground up with them. And I love that from what was inside the walls of the studio. Like I'm really proud of that record, and it was great to work with them on that. But at that time, they were kind of already signed to RCA, so we were under a lot of major label pressure, even though we were doing an indie record. And it was hectic, and there was a lot of gross stuff. It was a learning experience for me, and that was one of those times where it became harder for me to shelter it from the band. And it probably was naive of me to think I could, because they were also having their own conversations. They had just signed to RCA at that point. At any rate, there was a lot of not just making music going on in that process. So by the time we got to Perfect Pitch Black, and they had gone through their whole adventure, and then we were just back in a room making a record together, totally way better.
Right.
You can imagine. Listen, there's a lot of great stuff that happens in that world, but like there's also stupid things like board meetings about whether you should have like screaming and singing on the same song. It's like You know what I mean? So finally we're in a room together and you can just sing and scream on the same song and you don't have to worry about like what comes out of the 45-minute fucking board meeting about it.
Right.
So that was the kind of energy that made that great. A lot of the starting tracks on it were actually demos for what was going to be the next major label record before all decisions were made. So it was interesting in that way too, that it's kind of like a little bit of a studio light record in that like we didn't initially know a lot of those tracks were going to be final album tracks. So we were whipping through it demo mode. And then when everything happened, I think I talked to Steve a lot about it at the time, but I was just like, you know, this is really fantastic material. And I know you guys have gone through a really hard thing, but it would be a shame to let this just sort of like sit in on the floor gathering dust, you know? So
absolutely.
So it was more important to work with what we had and just get that sort of going. And then it became its own thing, which I'm really proud of.
Nice. I was asking JR because I love the snare sound on that record. And I was asking him if he recalled what snare he used. And he said he thought it might have been a Black Beauty. Do you recall what snare was used?
I don't, but it sounds like one. I would think it probably is one. Yeah.
The classic, such a great snare sound on that one, man.
That thing is only going to sound as good as the arm that's beating the crap out of it. So
right. Well, I mean, that's another interesting thing. I mean, I think a lot of engineers, and it's kind of really dependent on the room as well. I've played in smaller rooms where I kind of need to play not so loud and maybe raise my cymbals up a little bit, but be careful how I'm hitting the cymbals, because if we want to lean on the room mics, then the cymbals are affecting all the room mics. So
what asshole told you that?
Well, I'm not going to say, but you seem to capture drummers in their natural hard-hitting habitat, and I think that transfers to the drum sound and ultimately the recording. So that's something cool and something that I would identify as sort of intrinsic to the sounds of your records, you know?
Oh, right on. There's kind of like two approaches. Either it's very studio heavy, or I want to remove the studio from the experience and I want it to feel like you're just experiencing the band, you know? So like, and that's always a battle for me. Like it depends on the project. And sometimes feeling the sound of the band is extremely dry and close and dead sound. And that's the sound that the song needs. But I still want it to sound like a drum kit. Like I've never really sort of like, unless it's been project specific, I'm not one to fall into a bunch of sample replacing of anything. Like I want it to sound like the drummer, you know, I want it to sound quiet. I don't want it to sound loud when it's loud. And I think that the walls that you capture that in is an important part of it, for sure. And also I think early on, when I first started, I was so inspired by a lot of dry recordings. And by that, I mean, it was coming out of new wave world and you had a lot of stuff that was like bone dry and no reverbs, no fake reverbs. And I was like, for years, I was totally against fake reverbs. I was like, oh, it sounds like shit. It sounds so fake. Fuck that.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think I fell in love with using the ambience of the spaces I was recording in. And it works. I've definitely softened on that position. Sometimes, you know, a reverb is the right way to go. But at any rate, like using the ambience of the space that something is recorded and captured in is definitely something that I like doing, just because it helps define that recording in that moment, you know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when I think about recording vocals, I've recorded guitar solos for some of my records and stuff. And that stuff is fairly easy when you're just talking about one mic, you know, and then I would feel differently about a guitar cab and maybe the spacing off of the grill where it is, and then the spacing off the cone and or the angle. But then once you get to drums, when you're talking about the close mics, the room mics, the overheads, everything else, there's more probability for, I feel, you know, for phasing and everything else. Like, did it take you a while to get to a place where you were like, I'm getting the drum sound that I want? Because drums, I'm a drummer of 30 years and I'm like nervous about the idea about recording drums myself.
Definitely took a long time. There was definitely things that, you know, there was inspiring records and inspiring producers and a complete lack of understanding to me why my stuff didn't sound like their stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty neurotic and pretty competitive in my own head, and I just wouldn't let it go. So like I read everything, I listened to records, I just listened to, like, you know, what is going on with that snare drum? And I just wouldn't let it go until I could get somewhere close. And again, that in itself was naive too, because a lot of times it would be like not only the player and the drum itself, but the choice of microphone. And, like you're trying to get the sound of something with like, a $2,000 microphone going through a $100,000 console, and you're using a $50 microphone and a $200 console. Like, I didn't know any different. I was like, no, it's got to sound as good.
Right.
And part of that journey, you find your own stuff. A lot of times a lot of work. I worked for 10 years at the studio in Boston that I love called New Alliance. And that was a basement studio with low ceilings. And a lot of these records I liked were in bigger rooms with more air. Right. So I started learning all these tricks on how to sort of make a small room sound bigger, instead of if you're trying to capture ambience, instead of just putting it towards the drum kit, put it away from the drum kit against another surface so that you're getting a reflection off that surface. Tricks like that started early for me. And I think, after doing it long enough, then you start getting, a good bag to go into.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've got a drum room here in this house, and it's down in the basement. So it's pretty short ceilings. I mean, I'm 6'2". If I get a little bit on my tippy toes, my head will touch the ceiling. So we're maybe 6'3", maybe 6'4" is the ceiling. But I tell you what, when I play my drums down there, it just sounds like they're going through like a massive drum amplifier, and it's so thunderous. It fucking sound, just the immediacy of a small room with like low ceilings. Right. It sounds, now, then again, I don't know how that transfers in miking, but you would think if it sounds good to your ears, it's a matter of just positioning to then capture the natural sound of that room, albeit a small one, right?
Yeah. And when I'm making a record, I never want it to sound like every song was recorded in an hour. Like, I want to find the unique personality of those songs, So going back to what we were talking about before, sometimes that, a larger room with a lot of air helps, and a slower tempo, as an example, for sure, would be helped with the bigger room. And then sometimes like having that closeness and intimacy is a thing. So you switch up the room and you capture the sound of that, the drums in that room. And there's nothing irrelevant to that. Like there's a lot of power to whatever that room is, as long as you're capturing it. And you said something too, which is knowing how to play a room is a big one too. If you know what's working in that room a little bit, and that alters your thing, in the end, I'm supposed to just put microphones up and capture what you do. So like, if you're making those decisions based on the walls around you, that's important too.
Right, man. Throughout the years, is there any sort of consistent mistake that you see bands come into the studio or in a recording environment with? And it doesn't have to be specific to drummers, although I'm sure it could be. And that could be attitude, execution, anything else. Just one of the things that maybe bands kind of consistently make a similar mistake throughout time with and going into studios.
It's hard. I mean, I think fatigue is a big one. Like,
for sure.
People that come in and they like, I mean, the whole like budget and expectation thing could be brought up. Like, someone's like, oh, I want this record to sound like whatever. I want it to sound like White Pony. I got $1,500, and you're like,
it's not going to happen, buddy.
And then, so it's like, all right, so $1,500 buys this amount of hours. And then you're trying to play like a full length 12 songs in a day.
Right.
And your limbs are used to practicing 2 hours, and I'm focusing more on drums because I'm talking to you, but
sure.
So I think the expectation versus what your body can actually do is a big one.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've at least said, if I'm going to record drums in one day or one session, that I try to not go past 6 songs, and of course these aren't super long songs, maybe 4.5 minutes, etc. I'm not playing, 10-minute prog opuses and trying to do 5 of those within a day. Yeah, exactly. Next time. And it's going to be your job to fix it all.
Right on.
Oh, man. But one of the records also that I really love of yours is the Visqueen record from Unsane. And it's such a powerful record. The bass, again, that's like, it's such a massive sound to that record, because I feel like Chris's guitar tone has its own kind of unique quality, and that the bass kind of fills it out. The drums are crushing. It's such a cool record. What do you remember about that session? Because I love that record.
Yeah, thank you. I love that record too. I was a fan of the band. I'd done a bunch of shows with them, with various bands. I kind of knew them a little bit just through that scene, and such a powerful live show. And a lot of that was where that bass sat. Like I was thinking a lot of your experience seeing Unsane live and seeing Dave just like knuckle his way through those just jamming it, you know?
Yeah.
That was a big inspiration for that record. Another big one was, there's definitely a fair amount of overdubs, but trying to remember that they were a three-piece, and that was part of the power of that band.
Yes.
Was that they're a three-piece. So finding that space for the different parts. I think there was sometimes where it really, a lot of it was just one performance from each of them. There's kind of panned off instead of like the usual bass up the center,
right?
You know, giving more space to one, giving more space, but you know, like a lot of people are like have it on the headphones. They're like, well, that's not where bass goes, but for making that sound, that really worked. I was just really excited to work with them. I also know that was one that happened pretty fast, and I knew that Dave was into the recording side of stuff. He's really talented, both in the studio and as a live soundman. But for the most part, Chris was someone you have to move fast with in the studio. So early on, I took the role of removing anything technical, anything studio totally away, so that they just went into a room, played a song, came in, listened to it, went into a room, you know, so they weren't around for a lot of the editing stuff. There's a bunch of comping that like I would, you know, they'd be like run out to get a lunch or something, and I'd be furiously trying to comp it so that by the time they got back, we're doing tracks over whatever the final thing is, no problem. But like I didn't want them to see any of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that worked well, because this was our first time working together. Very strong personalities. Chris wanted to move really fast. Working with Vinny was great, but we hadn't worked together before. So that was my concept for doing that record. And yeah, it worked really well. And then when it came to the mix, I told them to leave me alone, because I knew there was a potential for sort of like backseat driving early on. So I said, leave me alone for a day. Let me set up the first mix. They did. They came in, and they were really happy. Chris was like, I don't want you to touch anything. Just print this, and then I had the trust on both sides of the process with them, and then we could go and do the rest of it. So that was awesome.
Yeah, dude. The song "Last Man Standing" on that record is always the one that I feel like I go to immediately. The riff on the tail end, just everything about it. It's like the tempo and the tones and everything are so quintessential Unsane. And again, the production, the way that it's just presented is so crushing. It's so good, man.
Oh, it's good to hear. It's good to hear. The other thing with that record was I felt that band, though the sounds of those records were great for what they're part of your experience and your memory of it. But a lot of their, existence in early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, like over compression and mastering and stuff like that, there wasn't really a space to have a lot of dynamics. And that was something that I wanted to get back, because they play that way. And especially some of the songs on that record really benefited from that. So that was another thing that I wanted to try and capture.
Yeah. In speaking about Dave with Unsane, and I mentioned it earlier, I really love the two Pigs records, and I was fortunate enough to see y'all live as well at the time. I think one of my bands might have even played a show with y'all at Union Pool, but I swear in my mind I think that happened.
Yeah.
So that means it happened.
Maybe.
Yeah, but I just, those records especially, I thought they sound so good, man. Great songs. Definitely, of course, there would be that sort of Unsane connection with a different spin on it. And I don't know, was it different for you being a player on the record and then and working with Dave and everything else in working on those records? Because they sound awesome.
Yeah, thank you. It definitely was. I had pretty much just sort of assumed when I moved to New York that I was giving up playing and I was going to be just making records. And that was okay to me. It's the same amount of time to sort of manage your band and manage your career recording bands is like it's a ton. So I was comfortable with that fact, and I would like play bass on projects here and there, but it wasn't until that came up they asked me if I would play with them, and I was fans of both of their stuff, and they were both in JJ Paradise Players Club, which if you remember that band's fantastic. So there's no way I was saying no to getting in a room just to jam, and then it just went really well. So it was great to play with them, and the concept of that band is it was like kind of the ability to just be in a band where there wasn't sort of like, there was no pressure. There was no pressure. We did it when we wanted to do it, which was sometimes hard. You know, Dave at that point, not only busy with Unsane, but also doing front of house for Melvin's and Big Business and all that stuff. And, between, my work and Jimmy's work, it was hard to schedule, but that was part of what made it great, was like whenever we had time, we'd be like, hey, in like 7 months, what do you think about doing this 2-week tour? And and then we're like, yeah, that's great, So the lack of pressure was kind of the concept of the whole thing. Like, it has to be fun. There's no sort of rock star or anything. And so that was fantastic. There was no idea that was too crazy to try, but there was also no pressure to sort of be like, we have to sort of like have this be this way or this or that. It was like, it could be anything. So it made it a really fun time when it lasted. One of my favorite sessions with them was the Co-Extinction recording, which came in between the two albums. We did 2 covers and we ripped apart a Betty Davis song, and it was a blast. We're like, it was one of those sessions where it was like, how much more stupid could we make it? And we're like, let's try.
That's good.
And that sort of like mutant sort of approach to being in a room and playing music is what that band was, which is just a playground for me.
Nice. Yeah, man. Again, those they sound so good, man. A couple of guys that I've worked with originally out of Brooklyn, Justin Mantooth and then Tom Tierney, a couple of guys. I know both of those guys are fans of both you and Kurt Ballou. What do you are there any Kurt Ballou recordings? I mean, obviously he's done a lot. Are there any particular ones of his that especially kind of stick out in your head as being, I mean, I mentioned the Russian Circles one, that thing sounds amazing. And there's all the other ones between Trap Them and his own records with Converge, and the list goes on. But
yeah, it's funny. I mean, there are so many great ones. I love Kurt. No one can do Kurt but Kurt. And that's part of the when I was talking earlier about trying to sort of examine tones and sounds, like I listen to Kurt records and I'm like, I would never approach insert instrument here. I would never approach like a kick drum that way, but it's works so perfectly and it's so Kurt, and the sound of his records are so great. I mean, in my mind, it's like if I could produce the world, I would put Kurt and Metallica together to finally make the Metallica record everyone wants to hear,
I hear you.
because he would do such a fucking great job. But anyway, I don't produce the world. I can barely walk my dog, so so that won't happen. But I love Kurt. There's so many good sounding records. I can't think of one off the bat, but the what happens to me sometimes is we work on a lot of the same bands and say at different times, and so there's a lot of referencing of past material when I'm working on a band.
Sure.
Including if I've worked with a band before and I'm doing a new record with them. And so just recently I was mixing a new Ken Mode album that we were working on, and
Nice.
They've worked with a long list of fantastic producers and engineers. And I was really closely listening to a lot of the stuff that Kurt did with them on the one album he did, and again, I think it's up there with the best of anything that they've done sound wise. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, that's interesting because again, I know people that would point to the two of you. Yet, I think your records obviously sound different. But then again, I mean, you working predominantly, I guess, with like heavier bands. You both have different approaches, and both have kind of your own individual sounds associated with it. But the two of you are really two of my favorites as well.
Oh, that's good to hear.
So it was cool to kind of hear you talk about Abe being it and sort of thinking about how you might have approached something differently, but ultimately, it still sounds great regardless on either side.
Oh yes, nothing but total respect. When I hear the final product of an album like that Ken Mode album that I was listening to, I'm like, this is just so good. The energy's there, the sound is there. Like he's great. I enjoy his recordings and I enjoy the moments that we get to run into each other. So
yeah, man. One last question for you, kind of a crazy time, sad time, I would say. I know when you opened up your studio down in Gowanus along with mutual buddy Johnny Lamacchia, and I guess he had the rehearsal spaces, and then you had your studio, and then, of course, some 100 or never even preceded storm comes through New York and blasts all the toxic sludge of the Gowanus Canal up into your fucking studio. Like, how long had you even been open when that happened? Because that was a devastating scenario.
Yeah, I've said this a lot. If you ever want to have a roadmap of how to run and own a studio, do not follow mine.
Oh, fuck, man.
From the moment I moved to New York, it's like you're dealing with like 5-year leases and not the most business savvy sense. So I had already moved a few times to different locations, but we found this space in down in Gowanus, and though it was near a Superfund site, it was a good spot, and it was during their session, so we were able to find a spot that supports the concept of having a few studios and a bunch of rehearsal spaces.
Yeah,
and that was I can't remember how long it took to build it out. It was a lot, but I think we were only open about 4 or 5 months, and then Hurricane Sandy came. The destruction was so complete from our experience at Hurricane Sandy that you can't even a lot of people got really fucked up. There was, we had a lot of practice spaces and bands had all of their love in there. Right. So I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for myself that what happened was we were right next to the Gowanus Canal. And by the time the storm surge happened, it was 7 feet of toxic sludge water that came in, right, and literally hit each room and started acting like a washing machine, spinning water around, creating pressure that would blow out a wall. Then it would go to the next room, blow out a wall. So by the time we came in there was solid 2-inch solid wood doors, studio doors that were cracked in half from the pressure of the water.
Oh man!
There were pianos that were on one side of the building that were on the other side, totally flipped upside down. So there was no maybe we can clean up, there was just grab whatever you can and just leave.
Fucking hell, man.
And it set up years of trying to figure out what the next step was, the right way of doing the next step. But, it happened. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a big space. I remember when y'all had your opening party, going around and checking it out and looking at the rooms and everything, and it was such a cool space. But I mean, I imagine you had a lot of gear in there. So just, I'm trying to fathom, I guess, being like, okay, got to start over, got to recollect.
Yeah, and part of the whole build out wasn't insured. There was a massive loss, but it took a while to get back on our feet and figure out what to do, what to do next. But what can you do?
Ay.
I don't know. I feel like, in a world that we are in today, after the last 2 years of what everyone's gone through, and many hundreds of thousands haven't, and and what we're seeing on the news right now, it's like it left a bruise, but I'm still making some of my favorite records, so it's okay.
Nice. You're making some of my favorites as well, so I'm glad that's all happening, man. Despite all the bullshit.
Thank you.
Is there anything, I guess, upcoming that you would even be able to talk about that you're excited about, or?
It's one of the things that's interesting was because COVID hit and live touring and shows stopped, then record releases stopped. So there's actually a backlog of a fair amount of stuff. Like there was a Sasquatch record that I made in 2019 that was they've been holding on to, that it's like, I just want it out there for people to,
Right.
I'm sure they do more than I do, but
Yeah.
I just there's that Ken Mode record I was just talking about, ambitious project where we actually recorded 2 companion albums that I think the release will be staggered.
Nice.
But that's exciting. There's this band that I was lucky to mix from Finland called Gazeless. Small band, but I really loved working on their stuff, and I'm hoping that they follow up with the full length soon.
Nice.
I'm working on the new Julie Christmas stuff. We've been working on it for a while now. We're about halfway through an album, and it's really exciting, really special. There's all sorts of exciting stuff going on. So
excellent. Something to look forward to. Sweet. Well, Andrew, again, man, thanks for your time, dude. It was great talking to you, and best of luck in 2022, my man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for including me in. I'm humbled to be included in the list of people that you've talked to. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, man. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Hope to bring more of these conversations with engineers and musicians at large, and even spread further out into the world of maybe even athletics and extreme sports and whatnot. So hope you all enjoy the ride. We'll catch you on the next one. Crash, bang, boom.